In 1934, in the cold harbor city of Duluth, Minnesota, death had a familiar face. It arrived quietly, it signed paperwork neatly, it brewed warm soup and whispered prayers at the bedside. Her name was Margaret O'Len, and every man she married died. Margaret began her career as a private caretaker. She worked for elderly men living alone near the harbor, men whose families had moved on, whose friends were few. She came highly recommended. Churches praised her devotion. Neighbors spoke of her kindness. Families desperate for help saw her as a blessing. She was polite, organized, and utterly reliable. Her duties were simple, but she handled the meals, ensuring they were warm and on time. She administered medication, sorting pills into neat little cups. She managed the bills, the letters, the pensions, and eventually, she would help with the wills. To the outside world, Margaret was mercy itself. She was the steady hand in a fading life, a final comfort in a lonely world. She wasn't just a caretaker. She was a companion, a confidant. In the quiet homes of these aging men, she became indispensable. Her presence was a constant, a source of order and calm. But beneath the surface of this perfect charity, a different story was beginning to write itself. One letter, one meal, one signature at a time. The city saw a saint, but history would come to ask a much darker question. Her first husband was Thomas Reed, a retired shipwright in his 70s, a widower who had spent his recent years staring out at the gray waters of Lake Superior. Margaret arrived at his home in the spring of 1934. Within 6 months, they were married. Neighbors noted the change in him at first. He seemed healthier, more engaged. He walked with a straighter posture and even smiled more often. But then the change shifted. He grew quieter. The walks stopped. He became absent, a shadow in his own home. Friends who dropped by were told he was resting. When he died a year later, the doctor listed natural causes: a weak heart, a long life. It was a simple, sad story, common in a town like Duluth. Margaret, now a widow herself, inherited the house and a modest sum of money. There was no suspicion, no questions were asked. It was just the gentle, inevitable conclusion of a life well lived, and a marriage that had brought a lonely man some final comfort. Grief was a private affair, and Margaret grieved with quiet dignity. Over the next 18 years, a pattern began to form, subtle as the slow-moving fog that rolled in from the lake. Margaret married 5 more widowers. Each story echoed the last. Each man lived alone with no close family to watch over them. Each one came to trust Margaret completely, placing their lives and their legacies in her capable hands. And each marriage followed the same quiet, predictable rhythm. It always began with caretaking, then a proposal, a simple courthouse marriage. This was followed by a period of apparent happiness, which slowly gave way to declining health. And finally, death. The inheritance always passed to Margaret, a house here, a savings account there. With each passing husband, her wealth grew. But her methods never changed. There was no drama, no sudden illness, just this slow, patient erosion of a life. Doctors saw old age. The church saw unwavering devotion. The city of Duluth, busy with its own affairs, saw nothing at all. She moved through these lives like a ghost, leaving behind only perfectly ordered paperwork and a string of well-tended gravies. Margaret never rushed. She never argued. She never raised her voice. Her power wasn't in force, but in stillness. She controlled everything through a quiet, unshakable routine. She decided when they ate, what they ought. She determined what medicine they took, and when. She controlled who they saw, politely turning away old friends at the door with a quiet word about her husband needing rest. She managed the mail, deciding which letters were read and which were simply put away. Some neighbors noticed the subtle shifts. The men, once social, stopped going outside. The sounds of friendly visits faded. Voices that once carried from open windows disappeared behind drawn curtains and closed doors. There were no bruises. There was no sign of neglect. If anyone had looked for poison, they would have found none. There was no evidence of a crime because there was no obvious act of cruelty. There was only silence, a deep and pervasive quiet that settled over each house she entered. It was a control so absolute, so gentle, that it was invisible. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a teacup, and in her world, that was more than enough. Her 6th and final husband, Edgar Mills, died in 1952. He was a retired accountant, a man of numbers and ledgers, and it was in the world of numbers and ledgers that the first and only flicker of suspicion arose. After his death, a clerk at the county records office was processing the paperwork. He noticed something strange, something unsettling in its perfect efficiency. Margaret had prepared every single document before Edgar had even passed away. The will, signed and notarized. The bank accounts, ready for transfer. The burial arrangements, paid for in full. It was the work of someone who wasn't just prepared for death, but was anticipating it with absolute certainty. The clerk reported his unease, but his superiors found nothing to act on. The paperwork was immaculate. Every signature was valid. No law had been broken. Margaret O'Len, now a 6-time widow and a woman of considerable means, walked away from Edgar Mills's life just as she had from all the others. She was wealthy, she was respected, and she was, for all intents and purposes, completely untouchable. So, was Margaret O'Len a serial killer, or was she simply the unluckiest woman in Minnesota? History offers no easy answer. There was no definitive proof. No coroner ever found a trace of poison. No witness ever testified to an act of violence. The only evidence was circumstantial, a collection of unsettling coincidences. There was only the timing, the uncanny rhythm of marriage and death. There was only the inheritance, the steady accumulation of wealth from one lonely man to the next. And there was only the isolation, the quiet severing of ties that preceded each man's final decline. Did she simply have a knack for choosing ailing men, offering them comfort in their last days and benefiting from their gratitude? Or did she understand something darker about human nature? That control doesn't always need to leave a mark, that the will to live can be slowly eroded. Not with a weapon, but with a whisper. That by controlling a person's world, their food, their medicine, their contact with the outside, you can, perhaps, control their time in it. The question lingers unanswered in the cold Minnesota air. Margaret O'Len died in 1971, alone in the last house she had inherited. There was no husband to care for her, no devoted caretaker to manage her affairs. Reports from the time say there were no mourners at her funeral. She was just a woman who survived 6 men, who built a life on the end of theirs. She was a testament to the fact that in a world that looks for bruises and broken locks, silence is often the perfect hiding place. Sometimes, the most terrifying figures in history are not the ones who lash out in a fit of rage. They are the ones who never break the law. They are the ones who just wait.